First of all, it's great to see everybody. Great to be back here after our COVID experiences, and as absolutely impact that it made in all of our lives and our ability to meet and see each other face to face. This feels like a homecoming of sorts. But I've got Mike here from his perspective. He's been in all the meetings. You know where he's been relative to the combine. And, of course, Stephen has been in all the meetings, and that's what we're doing. We're getting ready for Thursday and excited about it, and excited about being with you guys and working through the next few days and building our adding to the Dallas Cowboys team. So any questions? Fire away.
Just Jerry and Mike, before we focus on the draft, since we haven't had a chance to ask you about this, can you comment on Kelvin Joseph and his involvement in this murder case, and any action you may or may not take with Kelvin will be strictly dependent on anything that any charges that are filed against him, or would you consider doing something aside from any charges that may come?
I get all the information directly. I hear directly from our counsel, our Cowboy counsel, would hear directly from anything from the league. It's, as you know, it's under investigation. I don't know any more than what I've seen you write or seen written. And it's certainly pending. But I have no information in any way that affects his status during this time of the year. We're in our early season workout time, and he's very active and involved in getting ready for the coming season. And anything that would alter that are in the hands of any decision making that would regard the authorities or the league, of which I've gotten no information on that, period. Just nothing that I can comment on, and I certainly don't have any opinion. I don't know any of the details.
Coach, have you had any interaction with Kelvin regarding the situation? What were your discussions with him like?
My conversations with Kelvin was more about the focus of what we're doing here in the off season, and he's been here throughout the month of March and has been a full participant here the first couple of weeks.
Does that situation affect draft preparation and what you may or may not have thought about the need of cornerbacks?
No.
Why not?
Just because I said so. Did you ask me? How these guys? Okay.
And Mike, just last thing on that, would you consider any sort of action outside of what the authorities would do, just based on the situation at all, or is it?
I think, just as Jerry's already stated, we're just watching the process, and that's all we really have to comment on right now.
Jerry, you talked last week about the appetite for possibly trading up. Were you talking about that specifically in the first round or the second?
Generally. And that is purely a product. If the phone's not ringing, that's me calling. And so the bottom line is, if you don't know what might be coming, it is always the case that it's got to be coming towards you, as opposed to you going to get it. To put it in its right context, when I said we might consider trading up, it would be madness to not consider anything as we mentally prepare for the draft. And tradings can be a big part of things. We've had busy times in drafts and slower times in drafts, but I think the question was that I answered at the time, which I'm not being defensive at all, is would you consider it? Specifically with that, it's more of an answer. I would not consider anything as we're sitting here getting ready for the draft.
Stephen, when you look at your guys' board, what could potentially be there at 24, just how do you feel about the options that could potentially be there?
Oh, I think we're going to have some great opportunities. I think, it's impossible project, but I will say this about the draft. I think it's very middle of the draft heavy, that third through the fifth round. First and second a little more thin than we're used to, but I still think we're going to have a great opportunity to really improve our football team. Whether it's at the 24th pick, if we decide to make a move to go up, then there's some players that would fit that category that you might be intrigued by, and then there's always the option that if 4 or 5 guys are sitting there that you really think a lot of, then it's not impossible. We might move down a little bit, but in general, I think we're going to have a great opportunity to improve our football team in a big way throughout the draft. As you know, we have 9 picks, and I just think it's a great opportunity for us to get better.
You prepare for a lot more scenarios when you're sitting at 24 versus, say, where you are last year, just because.
You have to. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just you got all these teams in front of you, and you're not sure what they're going to do and how they have these players evaluated. I think, as you've seen, I think in, people reporting, and they have obviously, I'm sure, great people they talk to in all the other organizations. It's a mixed bag in terms of who might do what and who might take what. So you really do have to go through a lot of options. We've already started that extensively with Jerry and Mike, Will, and myself. And I think you do have to get prepared like that. And then certainly you have to see what you're going to be giving up. And that takes you really deep when you go, 24 picks into the second round, in terms of what you might be giving up to move that pick up. So there is a lot of work left to be done. But, at the end of the day, I think the players are there that can really improve our team.
Stephen, with so many teams in the league right now seeming to kind of change their approach to go more all in, the big trades we see for the wide receivers, the Rams specifically, like get rid of their early draft picks. Does that change your philosophy, your guys' philosophy, and how you build your team at all when so many other teams seem to be kind of shifting to a more aggressive all-in approach right now?
I think everybody's situation's different. And we have to look at our situation in terms of our players and where we have our resources committed. I think there's always going to be opportunities out there that you have a chance maybe to stretch and really improve your team if you think it's the right piece. At the same time, as you know, we believe strongly that you build through the draft. It's your foundation. But then when you have an opportunity, that sticks out and you can improve your team, then you certainly look at it. But, everybody's going to continue to look at different ways to go about it. Obviously, the Rams winning the Super Bowl had a different approach in terms of how, they valued their picks versus the players they brought in there. And, I don't think it's, one right way to do this. I think there's a lot of ways to go about it, and certainly we'll continue to massage things internally, and we'll make decisions. One of the things I think is unique about our organization, having Jerry as the owner and the general manager, that we can make quick decisions and can make hard decisions quickly. And so I think that gives us an advantage in terms of if we decide to do something, that's on the real aggressive side, then we can do it.
Could you, each of you, address how you see the positional strengths of this draft aligning with your perceived needs?
Well, I think like anything, you trust the process. We're going through the process of ranking the board horizontally and vertically, and from that, you have, our view of our needs may be different than yours, but I think at the end of the day, I know from my perspective, the quality and the depth of the class is important to stack it against these first 2 classes. So, this is an opportunity for us to obviously improve with these new guys coming in here, but to get in here and talk about specific positions. I mean, obviously, if Jerry wants to get into that, that's fine. I just think the quality of the class and how they fit into our locker room is really the overall view from my perspective.
Jerry, I know you're being a little tongue-in-cheek there when you said the phones aren't ringing, but you're calling. Have you been making any calls this week?
You hadn't heard the same country song I've had. Honey, when that phone's not ringing, that's me calling. It's the song. All right. But seriously, we always chum. Always. And you do that. I do it away from the draft. You're always talking about possibilities or things. There's nothing dangerous about thinking crazy things. What's dangerous is obviously when you get out and making a decision. So without getting philosophical, we should think out of the box. We should be contrarians. That doesn't mean that has to be that on that particular decision, but it's a part of thinking unconventionally. And so you got to see which way the thing is going. We had no idea Michael Parsons would be there last year when we started that draft. We all had our eye on corners. And the bad thing would have been to have not been flexible and to have not been willing to do something that you really hadn't gone to bed the night before thinking you'd hoped it would go that way. So, again, I think flexibility, we have it here. The way to be ready for it is to literally be prepared. And if you had been a fly on the wall this morning listening to our conversations, you would have heard some pretty interesting scenarios about what if this happened. And it's a product of having everybody on the same page regarding our weaknesses and our strengths on our team. Or philosophically, if we had a wish, how we would like to go defensively and what that player might do for us to complement what a Parsons or a Lawrence might do. So again, I know that this always comes down to pretty subjective type explanation, but it is subjective, and the very players themselves are subjective. And we have to bet and project a lot of things that don't necessarily fall right as they get on beyond here into their careers. So just understanding that only God knows really most of the time about some of the critical parts of the decision, I think, is important. You can milquetoast things to death, and you can be right down the middle. If you're perfect, the NFL is designed to win half your games and lose half your games. It's a 500 league. And so you have to get out of bounds, or you have to get close to the boundaries from time to time to sway that positively at all, in my view. So we will, as you well know if you think about it, we will be unconventional if we think it will help our team. We don't go in there just the idea of going the other way at all. So I would emphasize the best way to prepare for that is to keep communicating. We have constant communicating. We have communicated since the day we walked through the door with the Dallas Cowboys. And I've never not included the coach. Mike came from an organization, and he can speak for himself, that didn't include the coach as much in these processes of personnel. And they had a lot of success in that manner. We do. We want that process in there. And so if you were sitting in that room, you would hear some of the key people, the scouts, and you would think they were going to make the pick. And we encourage that. And we argue with that. And we talk about that. And that's important not only to hear it, but that's important to get that input. They might have some information that you should consider. So our process is an inclusive one. We've said it. There's a lot of talk in this business about who makes the call, who actually makes the call. Okay? Taco was Stephen's call. Parson is my call.
That's not that funny to me.
How many, I don't know if you've been asking, excuse me if you haven't, how many first-round picks are in this draft?
Do we have on our board?
Yes.
We're going to be somewhere between, 14 and 16, somewhere in there.
Is that a normal number?
So it's lower than normal.
Stephen, this is kind of related to that.
is it always best available over need, or does that dynamic change a little bit later in the first round versus like when you were at 17 a couple of years ago or 10 last year?
I think if the grades are in there very similar, then you pick what your need is. I think if there's a big disparity, you don't go jump a half a round down to scratch an itch, if you will. I mean, I think if they're in there close and the grades are really close, then, a couple points here or there, then, I think you certainly would take a look at, your need over over the best grade, just pure best grade.
With only 14 and 16 first round picks, does that, on your board at 24, does that open itself up to more of a move down than a move up, or how do you look at that?
I think it just depends. Not everybody's going to have the same number, the same guys in their picks, and they may have more, they may have less first-round picks. I mean, that's the art of competition right here, and everybody's trying to put their board up the way they see it. We put our board up the way we see it, and that might have you looking at moving up, even more so than moving down. If one of your guys you have in the first round are sitting there and you think, hey, that may be worth it to go get one. The flip side of that, if they're gone and you're looking at 4 or 5 guys you value similarly at 24 there, then you might, you might think about moving down. Or if there's just one left and you're up and it happened to go your way, then you pick away.
As you were saying, you had like fewer first-round grades, but Mike and Stephen, didn't both of you say that overall you have more players graded with draft grades than you normally do?
Absolutely. I think, with the super seniors, where they got a redshirt year and a COVID year, and I mean, we're looking at some players that have been in college and playing football for 6 years. And so you do see that. I will say I do think the draft's more heavily weighted toward the middle of the draft than it is, toward the top. But I do think there's more players that have draftable grades than we've ever had.
When you have that many players with draftable grades, how does that change the approach to the undrafted signing period on Saturday night? And then, especially keeping in mind that you guys don't have a 7th round pick, like what would that process be like?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, who's left and where we have them. And, sometimes we have no one left on our board. I mean, that's happened rarely, but, you have just a couple. And then sometimes you've had a lot more. We'll just have to see how this pans out and, how the rest of the league thinks of the players that we have on our board versus what's been taken through the draft.
Mike, why do you think it's important to be involved in the draft process, and what are the ways that your draft process involvement has been different this year than previously in your career?
I would say, number one, I think anytime the personnel and coaching can be together, whether it's training camp and having them part of your meetings, because we all want the same thing. It's about getting the best players possible, and fit is a big part of a lot of our conversations. We talked a lot today about fit with the coordinators in there. So I think it's like anything. It makes us stronger as a group. The decision-making process is tighter. This is year 3, so I mean, year 1 we were virtual. Last year was more realistic, and this is really the first full year that we've had as a staff. Our scouts are in-house, and so this has clearly been the best process of my time here, because the interaction, whether it's on the road, going getting out and seeing these players at their pro days, and also interacting with your scouts on the road. So just so much more collaboration, interaction, and I think with that it definitely improves your decision-making process.
Stephen, when you look at what you guys have done and not done in free agency in the offensive line, do you look at that as a must early on to find guys that come in as day 1 starters? What are your thoughts on Zion Johnson and Kenyon Green?
Yeah, we won't get into evaluating any of the players in here, but I will say this. I mean, free agency's not over. I mean, there's different waves of it, and you still can, there's still going to be opportunities to improve different areas of our team other than the draft or college free agency. So, I think that still can happen and probably will happen. I wouldn't say we have any musts left in terms of, having to take a particular position at some point. Obviously, we want, you'd like to look up 9 picks later and hope that you really helped yourself across the board in terms of not only, improving yourself for frontline players, but also depth and, things of that nature. So I don't think we have any musts going into the draft.
Is there a big difference between your first and second round grades on offensive linemen this year? In other words, you guys have done really, really well in the past picking offensive linemen in the first round.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to Frederick, Tyron Smith, Zach Martin. Is there a big drop off between your first round grades offensive linemen and second round?
No, I would say we probably got more top of the second round players maybe than we've ever had. It just didn't quite make the cut of being first round players, and then we have some players that are bottom of the first, so the grades, the grade difference very small.
Jerry, when you lose a guy like Randy, when you anticipated he might come back, how does a personnel loss like that affect your view of that position going into the draft?
Everything has an offsetting quid pro quo. Everything. As you know, I think a lot of Randy and how he has evolved and where he is in his career. But he evolved so well that he got beyond where I wanted to go. With the guarantees that were going to be involved to have Randy here, and I could have done it, were unacceptable to us. I'd rather have the two, Armstrong and our other one. I'd rather have those two than the one, and that's what we got. So this has very big logic to it. I'll just allude to the very same thing. Had you rather have two players over in the second round or one over in the first? That's what it costs you to get up to the first, is to trade that second round pick to get up there. Most cases, when we go down that board, we'd rather have the two, just as far as looking at a rule that you might go by. And so to be specific back to Randy, Randy, to his credit and their credit, Denver wanted him more than we did. And that's not a hard adjustment because we got extra players for that. And we wouldn't have. We wouldn't have had the players that we got had we signed Randy, period. And I'd rather have the two than the one. Availability was a big item here. Being available. Always has been. Always has been. And you can reach to a point where if you've got a big question mark on availability, forget ability. If you've got a big question mark on availability, do you want to strap on millions and millions of dollars to your salary cap with that big a question mark at availability? It got too high for the benefit of the team. And I think nobody thinks anymore of Randy's ability or of how he has evolved. And still think he's one of the, frankly, individually like him about as well as anybody I've ever been around as far as a player of the Cowboys. It just didn't work that way. It wasn't good for us to do that.
Stephen, when the last 8 years, there's been a pretty big shift on how you guys pick Power 5 guys compared to the previous 8. It's like 75% of your picks versus 56% of your picks. Has there been a shift in how you guys break it down and leaning more Power 5 schools than you have in the past? And what does a smaller school guy have to do to earn that consideration?
Well, I just think at the end of the day, it's all goes with the evaluation process. Hopefully we get better every year. I mean, he's made it real clear philosophically in our organization, you're either getting worse or you're getting better. There's no flat line here. And so we continue to look for ways to improve as to how we evaluate talent in terms of whether it's in college, whether it's in pro, whether it's our interactions, as Mike mentioned, which I think we do extremely well, of having our coaches interact with our personnel people in terms of what's the vision for the scheme we want to run and how those players fit and where they're going to fit, and so that you see when, hey, we draft a guy, the coach sees that guy the same way the scout does, and that's why think we've had so much success with players being able to come in and play right away. So, at the end of the day, there is obviously, as we see with the Power Five, they're the Power Five for a reason. I mean, they've got some really good football players, but at the same time, there are good players that aren't in the Power Five if you find the right guys that can step in here and play right away. But I don't think it's been a conscientious effort to just say, hey, we're going to get away from smaller schools and get into Power Five only, and that's where we're going to pick from. It's more, I think, just our evaluation process evolving into where, that's where we've, historically or not historically, where we've ended up over the past, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, whatever time frame that is.
Mike, what do you see when you've looked at this, the deepest positions in this draft, and just your overall thoughts on some of those positions and how it's stacking up?
Well, I think, traditionally, the wide receiver group has been very deep, and that looks to hold true again this year. So, and I think as you go up and down the board, and I just want to echo what Steven's already addressed, is, this is going to be a very deep draft, particularly in the middle rounds. So, and with that, as far as the ability to get both offense and defensive players, I think we sit very well for that opportunity.
The pandemic forced the organization and all the organizations to adopt certain principles, virtual and sort. Now that things have loosened up a bit in that regard, have you found that you've kept some of those pandemic-specific principles to make your draft process more efficient? And if so, can you kind of detail how you guys are handling pre-draft differently today than maybe 2019?
Yeah, I think that virtual is definitely a component of not only the draft process but our everyday operation. So, just you go as far as the off-season program this year. We've had 100% participation, but we do have individuals that have had things that are already scheduled ahead of time that, even though they were unable to be here, they were in the meetings virtually. So that was obviously something that was not in place in prior years. No different than the draft process. There's been times where we may need a little more information on a prospect, and bang, we were able to get the individual on a Zoom call that night. So, and I think so. The things that came out of the pandemic are definitely the virtual component is still in place. Obviously not to the level that it was 2 years ago, and I think it's an asset in our evaluation process.
Jerry, you spoke to the two players instead of one, regarding Randy Gregory and Armstrong and all of that. You guys had one of the most talented rosters in the NFL last season, but you've lost some this offseason to this point. How confident are you that after this draft process is done, after remaining free agency, that this Cowboys roster can be as talented or as good as it was a season ago?
Well, I thought that we were as talented going into the playoffs last year as any time in the top handful of teams that I've been involved in. So it's not surprising at all for us to have a catch up or have a bar of last year as where you would like to be. And so with that in mind, what ends up happening is that things that first-year players, second-year players evolve, and you can expect those to get better. If we have those, along with what we have done with the continuity of coming off of the COVID year last year and coming into the basic I'm going to say fundamentals, solidness of our off-season, the fundamentals of this draft process, and the fundamentals of taking what we started last year defensively. I think we can very easily be where we were last year talent-wise, or able to play at that kind of talent level. I believe that's going to be the case. Now, I'm not factoring in finding this year's Parsons. I'm not factoring that in. That last year that helped that situation along without being tried. So that in short, I feel very strongly that we can have a team that can give us every bit the promise to evolve and get us back where we were in the playoffs last year with the health level, the availability level, as well as the talent level that we had last year. And I can go down through and look at specifics just within. Dak should be in better shape than he was this time, but when he went into the playoffs, by virtue of having this offseason, and I'm going to assume we're not going to get another calf injury in the 5th game or 6th game. I'm going to assume we're not going to get a shoulder injury in training camp. But I think we could have a healthier Dak as you go into. That alone could put us in better shape for the playoffs. So anyway, all of those are what ifs, I understand. But you got to think about them and you got to plan on them one way or the other, and that's what we're doing. So to answer your question, I'm not willing to concede at all that by the time we get to the playoffs this coming year that we won't be every bit the team that we had going in the playoffs last year.
Stephen, when you talk about the top of the second round being as heavy as you can remember, can you talk about when you're in kind of that nebulous area late in the first round, deciding if you're going to move back or so, the club having the 5th-year option on the first round pick, is that a factor?
I think it is. I think it is, especially because what you want to do is sign players to that second contract, and when you have a 5th-year option, that gives you, that helps you with your negotiation versus, you're going to be dealing with somebody who's going to be totally free. Example, Dak Prescott. It's the perfect one. But certainly that would come into play. I know I've heard people say it time and time again on quarterbacks. If you're going to pick a quarterback, top of the second, bottom of the first, you'd like to have that extra year. So, those things are important. That certainly plays into it. It's a great observation, and certainly something that the teams do look at, and we look at from a salary cap standpoint. All that gets, mixed in terms of, when you're putting the full body of work into a decision, then that's certainly part of it.
Stephen, what's that process like, the dress rehearsals for these last couple of days, these weeks leading up to it, inside the war room, the practices and all of that? Do you guys go through all these, you mentioned the scenarios and all of that. Is that an enjoyable experience? Is it tense? What's that like these last couple of days leading up to the final day?
The thing I get the most out of is more the straight strategy, more so than, the mock drafts, which I think are useful. But I think the bigger thing are to really play through it in our minds, what's realistically going to be there versus what may or may not be there. Those are all things that are interesting, and then project down to what you might be passing in the second or what you might be passing with our pick in the third. I think all those things are important, but I do think the mock drafts play a role, and we do that extensively as well. But I think the most important thing is just to get your hands around, what caliber of player you're going to be looking at, what you'd be looking at, say, in the bottom of the second and potentially giving up along with your first pick versus, having 2 players versus 1. I think it's well said.
Would you anticipate with what you've seen in the free agent market with wide receiver salaries that could push some wide receivers up the board, if you will, and how do those things factor into a draft day, those trends?
Well, I think any of this, as you look at free agency, it certainly points to all the more how important drafting well is. If you can avoid, you just can't pay, even if you have success, which we feel like we've had, our share of success, if not more so, in terms of drafting successfully. You still can't give them all, every one of them, that second contract. So consequently, you have to make some tougher decisions. I mean, that obviously came down the pipe with us with, a successful pick in Gallup versus, ultimately having to make a decision. Are you going to be able to have, Amari and Gallup? And so you have to make that call. And I think all those things play into it in terms of, drafting successfully versus, having to pay for it from a resource standpoint. The draft's so important there in terms of making your cap work overall.
How's Gallup's status? Any updates on him? Does it still look like he's trending week 1 In other words, does that affect how you draft or free agency, just preparing for a possible contingency that he wouldn't be available week 1?
Michael's doing very well in his rehab. I mean, he's here every day. He's been here throughout the prehab, the surgery, and now the rehab. So, but I think once we get to training camp, we'll have a tighter view on exactly when he'll be available.
Jerry, you joked earlier about who makes which decisions in the draft room. How has your role changed in terms of player evaluation and draft decisions, if at all, here in recent years?
You know, I've got a good read in terms of the coach's involvement. We talked about that earlier. I have always thought that the men coaching the players should have an investment in the decision being made of putting the players out there. I guess I get that from my college days, if anything. So I've always thought that was the politically way to do it. I have seen people get ideas about players in the draft process as coaches and absolutely have a bias with them as they get on into coaching them. And so I've seen that. And they have to work through that bias to get that done. Well, it's better to have a buy-in. There's a lot of me that would like to take a player and hand it over when we draft him and have Mike sign it, have Steven sign it, have Will sign it, and then go down through the coaching staff and have everybody on there sign it. This is the guy we picked. And so that when somebody comes in and for whatever the reason he's needs more reps or he needs this or he's got an issue about how he's coached on the field. Bill Parcells used to joke about, he said, I don't want the scouts out there watching practice and talking about how I ought to have such and such playing more than such and such. He did that tongue in cheek. The point is, there really is buy-in here. And there's buy-in with how players are selected, and there's buy-in with after they're selected, how they evolve and how they're coached. I believe in that. So to answer your question, I've always been into the buying into. I used to have a sign on my desk, if you're willing to give others the credit, you can conquer the world. And that was the sign that I had all the way up and through the Dallas Cowboys. I hadn't been in this world of having a need to, well, who's making that call or who's making that call or who's making that call. Around here, if it has a dollar sign associated with it in any way, I make the final call. I'm responsible for the money coming in and going out ultimately. And so I make that call. I have been since the day I walked through this door. And so I intend to make the call and get to where I can assess the information that's coming to me so that we can make the call. That has not changed. That hasn't changed. Now, what has happened is that Steven's been doing this now for 33 years. And he walked in here with a chemical engineering degree. He ought to be smart enough to pick it up somewhere along the way. And but seriously, he has been around here, and he's been around in everything we've done. If you can't have confidence in that, you need to go home because he's seen it come and go and seen all the wrong decisions and all the right decisions as it goes there. So it's a luxury on my part to have that kind of talent around here. I've got it. The Cowboys have it in several places around here of real seasoned, but relatively speaking, young people to get in here and help make all contribute to making this decision. So it is wrong to basically look at a decision and say that Jerry made the decision to draft Michael Parsons. I did not do it. I did it, actually physically did it, but I had tremendous input from what people that I have a lot of respect for that have spent a lot of time getting ready to help make that decision. Will puts the board together. He didn't make the call. He puts the board together. If you watched how we get up on that board and who gets in the third hole, who gets in the fourth slot or the fifth slot, you would see that there's 15 people made that decision about how he gets in the 15th slot. That's not a one-person decision about who goes up there. And then it's damn sure not just a one-person decision when you're up there on the draft board and you pick that player off of that spot on the board. There can be all kinds of players still up on that board. but that's not a one-person decision. So to answer your question, it's being made exactly the same way that was always being made. Now then, I really do and should, in my spot, make other people believe they're making the decision. I should do that. I should work very hard to make other people believe it's their decision. Because if they think it's their decision, they will work their ass off to try to make sure it's a good one. And they will take ownership in the decision and they'll make it go. So I spend a lot of my time around making people be not only helping make the decision, but believing they made the decision. That gets accountability. That hasn't changed. None of this has changed at all. There's probably less risk-taking in me today than it probably was when I look back 30-something years ago from the taking of just outright taking risks. But when we got here, I frankly was the only one in the room that had ever taken a risk, certainly financially, when I first got involved. And so I knew how to take risks, knew how to judge the consequences if you mess up on a risk. And I was experiencing that. That's how I owned the Cowboys. That's how I got them. So I could do that. So I was the risk taker, going and coming. Today, after these years, we've got several people in this room that have taken some risks. This one's sitting right next to me, and he's eaten some of them. And he's been to the top in some others when he goes. So he knows the pain that goes with it. So same way, Mike, just exactly the same way. And I get mused when I see people write that, well, this is not the same Jerry, or this is this is that, this is that. They are just so off base, it's unbelievable.
Why are you taking less risk?
Why am I taking less risk? I said I believe that I could be taking less risk because, frankly, I feel that the decisions that Michael Parsons was not a risky decision relative to the situation. And so I seem to be more in keeping with the more logical way to make the decision. We still make some pretty risky decisions, though, and very capable of making them, too. We made that was when we take guys in the second round that we're redshirting. Those are risky decisions. Those are decisions putting that player's contribution off a little bit, usually, when it's a decision like Smith, or a decision really like several that we made around here. So that type of thing, a decision on off-the-field issues, I'm probably a little more conservative than I was 15 years ago. About availability, probably a little more conservative. Maybe a little more conservative about players on the come a little bit. Got some developing to do, need to get some strength because I feel like we need to use them now more than we did 15 years ago or more than 10 years ago. It's a now thing, and it has everything to do because we need those players, for instance, to play immediately because most of the money is going to the top 10 or 11 that are already here. And so those guys with their rookie salaries need to help us more immediately than they have in the past.
Since you said you got more conservative with guys with off-the-field issues, what made you comfortable about Kelvin Joseph despite his red flags last year?
Well, I think that you've gone into, let's be real clear, I haven't said I was comfortable or uncomfortable.
I'm talking about last year, though, he had red flags coming into the draft. There were people that had questions about issues.
Yeah.
And you were comfortable enough to take it.
I felt that we had him about where we should have him relative to his skill level. We thought he was one of the top ones, talent-wise. He got docked last year. And so I thought we had him gauged just right. We had the draft board right on him.
Finished up with Jory.
Y'all talked a lot during the season about how important it is to have the same 5 offensive linemen starting and how much multiple games together can improve that continuity. In light of that, how do you value position flex and versatility for an offensive lineman relative to other strengths?
I mean, position flex is important, obviously, especially now you got 17-game season. But yeah, the goal, I mean, the statistics speak for themselves. I mean, if you look at the success of an NFL football team that has consecutive starts by their linemen, they correlate. That's gone on as far back as I can remember. But I mean, you can't control the injuries and the things that happen. So I think just like anything, depth is important, but how you train players, in this class will be important because you got young players coming in. We have some older players, so these are the things we talk about: is how many reps is this young man going to get when he gets here? How's he going to fit it? What position flex does it give? So to answer your question, yes, it's very important. But I mean, the goal is to have the first 5, 1-5 play all the time because that's the most cohesive group. For your offense, and it dictates a lot of things that go on during the course of a game, let alone the season, especially into the playoff football. So, but position flex is something that's held, with a lot of value is looked upon as far as how they're graded, how they fit.
Thank you.
This has been a production of DallasCowboys.com and the Dallas Cowboys Football Club.
How about this, Cowboys?